Good morning. My name is Art Athens. I have the honor and privilege of serving as the director of the Naval Academy's Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership, and I'd like to welcome you to the 2014 McCain Conference. The Stockdale Center's mission is to empower leaders to make courageous, ethical decisions, and the McCain Conference is one of our premier programs to fulfill that mission. The conference's annual theme coincides with the research work done by the Stockdale Center resident fellows throughout the year and aims to bring together the best intellects in the military and civilian communities to address challenges in military ethics and leadership. We have 2 full days of discussion, debate, and reflection on this year's topic, which is comparative warfare ethics, traditional and contemporary. I hope over these next 48 hours that you will meet and interact with new colleagues and leave with a fresh perspective on the topic and ideas to implement in your sphere of influence. If there's anything my staff or I can do for you, please let us know. Now, to offer a welcome to the United States Naval Academy, I'd like to introduce the 85th Commandant of the Naval Academy, Captain Bill Byrne. Captain Bill Byrne is a 1987 graduate of the Naval Academy and a career surface warfare officer. Throughout his 27 years as a naval officer, Captain Byrne has served as a frontline leader at sea and on shore. Most notably, he has commanded 2 ships, the USS Halliburton FFG 40 and the USS Cape St. George CG 71, and served as the warfare analyst for the Navy's Director of Warfare Integration and the Division Chief for Anti-Terrorism Force Protection Programs in the J3 of the Joint Staff. Prior to assuming his current responsibilities as the Commandant, Captain Byrne served as the Chief of Staff for the Commander, U.S. 3rd Fleet. Since his arrival last year, Captain Byrne has brought an important theme to the Brigade of Midshipmen: be excellent. And this theme has resonated well with the brigade, and Captain Byrne's leadership continues to inspire these young men and women as they prepare to become our future Navy and Marine Corps officers. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Captain Bill Byrne, the Commandant of Midshipmen.
Thank you, Colonel Athens, for that nice introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Distinguished guests, on behalf of Vice Admiral Mike Miller, the Superintendent of the U.S. Naval Academy, I'd like to welcome you here to Annapolis, to the Naval Academy, and to the 14th McCain Conference. Though we spend a significant amount of time thinking about and studying our own perspectives on ethics at the Naval Academy and our sister service academies represented here today, we rarely pause to think about the other perspective, how other countries view ethics, and how their historical, cultural, and religious traditions inform their thinking about warfare. These next 2 days are an opportunity to do just that, to place ourselves in one another's shoes, an experience that will initiate some important dialogue and perhaps enable us to discover some common ethical ground upon which to build. My title, Commandant of Midshipman, is our fancy military way of saying Dean of Students. So I'm responsible, like my civilian counterpart, deans of students, I'm responsible for the day-to-day activities of the student body, and in my case, the 4,400-member Brigade of Midshipmen, as well as their health and welfare, their morale, their safety, and their discipline. The unique aspect for me, and for all of us here at the Naval Academy, is our responsibility to professionally develop them as ethical leaders, ready to lead in the Navy and the Marine Corps. The first line of the Naval Academy mission is to develop midshipmen morally, mentally, and physically, and to imbue them with the highest ideals of duty, honor, and loyalty. One of the ways in which we do that is by providing each of them with a liberal education. Despite whether or not they have a technical degree, all of them receive that liberal education. We do that by maximizing their exposure to others' perspectives. Whether it's our semester abroad program, our language and cultural immersion summer training programs, our inclusion of 59 four-year international midshipmen, or the classroom training in leadership and ethics that every midshipman receives. We're very proud of the opportunities they're afforded to broaden their minds and become well-rounded global citizens. And while I know this particular conference is not a midshipman-centric audience, I'm equally proud that the Naval Academy and the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership are hosting this conference and this impressive lineup of participants. Dr. Ed Barrett, the Stockdale Center's Director of Strategy and Research, and the Stockdale Center resident fellows have spent the last year studying, analyzing, and debating this topic, and have brought together the outstanding participants in this conference to further this discussion. I should mention that the Center's resident fellows who labored through the year on this topic received generous financial support from the Naval Academy classes of 1958 and 1962, and Mr. and Mrs. Frank Beam. Over the next 2 days, you will hear from some of the world's foremost thought leaders in the field of comparative military ethics, and from distinguished military practitioners who will be able to address the applications of these ethical principles both in peace and war. You will literally be spanning the globe once the week is done, from Asia to the Middle East to Europe. As you tackle the complex issues associated with comparative warfare ethics, I would encourage you to keep the conference's two primary objectives at the forefront. The first is to provide sound and relevant advice on this topic to the senior leaders of our respective military services. And secondly, to determine ways to integrate this topic in our classrooms and our professional military education at all levels. Finally, I would be remiss if I did not publicly acknowledge Mrs. Cindy McCain, who established this conference in honor of her husband, United States Senator John McCain, Naval Academy class of 1958. We're grateful for Mrs. McCain's generosity and Senator McCain's faithful service. Additionally, the Boeing Company, Northrop Grumman Corporation, and Mr. John Semkin, Naval Academy class of 1978, have been instrumental in enabling this conference to take place. Thank you again for traveling to Annapolis, taking time out of your demanding schedules to meet together. As Colonel Athens said, please do let us know if there's anything we can do to make your time at the Naval Academy more productive, more enjoyable, and please be assured that the work you do at this conference will have far-reaching implications, not only for all of us, but for the world at large. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Byrne, for those words. And to help us begin the dialogue and debate and discussions, I'd like to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Henrik Syse. Dr. Syse is a senior researcher at the International Peace Research Institute Oslo. From 2005 to 2007, Dr. Syse was the head of corporate governance at Norges Bank Investment Management, which manages the Norwegian Government Pension Fund Global, one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds. Dr. Syse has published many books and articles on ethics and politics, including Ethics of War, Classic and Contemporary Readings, and Natural Law, Religion, and Rights. He's the chief editor of the Journal of Military Ethics and part-time associate professor of the Norwegian Defense University College. Dr. Syse was a Fulbright scholar and holds a master's degree from Boston College and a PhD from the University of Oslo. We are very fortunate to have him with us this morning to kick off the McCain Conference. Please join me in giving Dr. Syse a warm welcome.
Commandant, officers, midshipmen and women, distinguished friends. It is indeed a great honor to be here. Such a great honor that I had readied my best jacket at home for my dark suit, and it's still in Oslo. So all I have is a jacket I traveled in, but at least it's navy blue, so I feel that there is something about it that is right. I am extremely honored to address this great conference. I've had the pleasure of being here before. The quality of speakers here is very high, so that I will start on a low level and you can rise up from there. I am also very happy to say that among the audience today are people I count my good friends. And I remember a saying from my grandmother from the Second World War, where she said about people she really trusted, that these are people you can evacuate with. And in this room, there are many people I would be happy to evacuate with. Now, I have a presentation that I think will be coming up here soon with just some keywords. There we are. And where you have my email address where you may send complaints after the lecture. I'll just start by asking the following question, very conscious of who I'm talking to. Can I say anything new? With such a distinguished audience of scholars, I am in doubt about whether I can say anything new, at least on a general, or as you probably say here, on an admiral level, about ethics, war, and religion. When we come to the specifics, sure, there are always new things to learn or forgotten facts to be reminded of, and we will indeed, in that sense, learn much new here from some of the most knowledgeable scholars in the respective religions and cultures. And I also would like to acknowledge the work that Ed Barrett and others have done over the last year here at the Naval Academy in doing research and teaching on this difficult field of different religions, cultures, and the ethics of war. But I ask myself, can I say anything new on an overall level to this audience? Well, I'll try. I remember my dad's favorite joke. He was a Norwegian politician, and he had this joke about a group of friends who used to meet to tell each other jokes, good stories. But after a while, they had been together for so long, so they knew all the stories anyway. So they just numbered them. So someone came in and said, 42, and everyone laughed. 68. Then a new guy comes in, and he wonders what is going on. So he tries out and says, 234, and they laugh their heads off. And he asks, why did you laugh so much now? Well, you see, we hadn't heard that one before. So we'll see if I can add anything at all. Well, let me start out with the following observation. If you go out on the street and ask people whether the terms ethical or just warfare on the one hand, and religious beliefs and institutions on the other make any sense when put together, it is not unlikely that you would get one of the two following replies, both negative. One answer will hold that religion is about respect for life or for God's creation, and that waging war therefore cannot be initiated and driven by sincere people of religious belief or by the institutions representing that belief. If it nonetheless seemingly is, we are confronted with hypocrisy or with politics, which some would say can be the same thing. Why is that so? Well, because true religion, as I said, is peaceful, opposed to violence, and leads us to higher ideals and goals than those attainable by war. The other answer would hold that religions drive people to commit acts well beyond the limits of ethical restraint. Indeed, that religions inspire crusades and holy wars, far removed from the rules and regulations of this world. And that is exactly because one has, as Bob Dylan memorably satirized it, God on one's side. In the next 2 days, leading scholars will investigate whether such negative answers are warranted, or whether various forms of religious belief do offer us a middle way, and thereby important resources, culturally and intellectually, to formulate meaningful restraints on and rules for the use of armed force. Historically, there is no doubt that religions have helped formulate rules surrounding war, including rules of ethical restraint. That is simply a historical fact. But what that means and what the religions actually say is for us to explore. Then maybe we can flesh out an account of religion and the ethics of war that goes beyond the two just mentioned introductory negative answers about the relationship between religion and military ethics. What I will try to offer you now in the next 42 minutes, I have a new watch for this occasion. I was told when I bought it that this can go all the way down to 200 meters below water. To which my wife said, "You're not going there." But that's the way it is. It illustrates the difference between men and women. I think it's cool. Now, what I will try to offer you as an inroad to this truly important conversation is twofold. First, I will investigate what various religious worldviews have in common, if anything, that potentially can make them a source or resource for the ethics of warfare. And secondly, I will draw on work that my esteemed colleague Greg Reichberg, who will be here tomorrow, and I have done, along with our fine managing editor Nicole Hartwell and a host of knowledgeable chapter authors, as we have put together a volume that encompasses text from 11 major religious traditions around the world on exactly this theme, the ethics of warfare and religion. Now comes the commercial break. This book is coming out soon from Cambridge University Press. I have brought flyers. There are some typos on them, but that's not my fault. And I'll put them all out on the tables afterwards. And I'm especially proud to say that some of those chapter authors are here today. I'd like to acknowledge the great work of Mohammed Fakfouri, Valerie Markeviches, and John Kelsey, who have contributed to making this, I hope, a first-rate volume. Now I see from my watch that I haven't fulfilled all the time of my commercial break, so I'll add at the same time that I'm here also together with excellent people from the Journal of Military Ethics, and I'd like to mention two of them, the two cooks, Martin and Jim, who helped me along with several others here edit the Journal of Military Ethics. Now, back to the program. For my first point, ethical restraints can, if we speak in large metaphysical terms, have two sources. They can come from human beings who themselves, individually or collectively, formulate rules and regulations. In purely humanist terms, such rules and regulations, or the norms underlying them, have human beings as their origin, period, whatever those human beings believe themselves. We are speaking then of positive law, created by necessity or convenience. Or such rules, regulations, and norms can come from some source perceived to be outside of or prior to human volition. And it is the latter that I would like to talk about and which will be the subject of many of the sessions here. For the latter kind of source, we often employ the term transcendent or transcendence, not primarily in the sense of that word invoked and popularized by Immanuel Kant, namely something that makes human thought and sense possible, but more in the traditional sense that I just intimated, namely that which is beyond, or in a non-chronological sense, before human volition. This transcendence can be experienced in various ways, through revelation, or at least what is claimed to be revelation, through tradition, through art, through community with others, or through intense personal experience. I'm coming here straight from Erfurt, Germany, where Martin Luther experienced the thunder and lightning that made him see the meaning of grace. In one sense of revelation, of course, all of these various ways can be seen, at least by the believer, as forms of revelation. Now, what religions, broadly speaking, and I'm not even daring to try to define what a religion is with this knowledgeable group of people, but it will come out in what I'm saying now, because what I would say that they have in common, ethically speaking, is exactly what I will call an openness to transcendence, also in an ethical sense. A belief that the roots of right and wrong lie not only in what human beings have decided, or what has pragmatically turned out to work, or what historically has more or less blindly formed. They share what Erik Voegelin, the great German-American philosopher, called a sense of the metaxy, an originally Platonic term used in the Symposium, meaning in between. The metaxic experience is the experience of being placed in between the ever-changing world of the material on the one hand, and some source of meaning or value that is not simply conditioned by that materiality on the other. Experiences of God's law, divine presence, or natural right can be instances of how human beings experience this metaxy. And those are experiences that are widespread in human history. They are arguably part of what it is to be a human being. The structure of human consciousness is metaxic, says Voegelin, building on, among others, the concept of openness formulated by Henri Bergson. And therefore come at least some of our notions of right and wrong. And as those of you who have read anything by Voegelin or by others of his generation, Carl Löwit, for instance, would insist, is that if we take away that tension, if we say there is only materiality or there is only God, and we take away the sense of living in the tension, we are also in danger of destroying what it means to be a human being. And that is, of course, a famous analysis of totalitarianism from after the Second World War, And if you'd like to see something very interesting on that, you should read the dialogue or correspondence between Hannah Arendt and Erik Vogelin after Hannah Arendt wrote her book on the origins of totalitarianism. Now you will ask me, what on earth does this have to do with the ethics of warfare? Or am I just now veering into esoteric philosophy and theology? No, I'll try to bring us back to our topic. I would put it thus. When faced with the awesome spectacle of war, of potentially sacrificing one's own life for that of one's compatriots, of taking the life of others, and of experiencing the chaos that accompanies armed struggle, one also inevitably faces the deepest question about the meaning of life itself. War brings us face to face with death, with right and with wrong. The belief in some sort of transcendence that accompanies most religious belief naturally comes into play in that situation, to cast judgment on, approve of, or restrain such violent action. In practice, of course, it is expressed in myriads of different ways, as we will see in the next 2 days. But overall, it encompasses a common denominator, the following: an attempt at coming to grips with the will of God or of the divine or of the order of the universe as one engages in that most fear-instilling of human activities. There are at least 2 ways in which this plays itself out. First, we have those instances where the divine is called on to, so to speak, sacralize or make sacred those armed struggles we find ourselves in, bring them to a higher plane, or infuse them with meaning. I'll come a little bit back to that at the end, because that, of course, can be quite unpalatable and dangerous. In those cases, the realities of war and power seem to come first, and religion arguably comes second. But then we have those instances where those who speak with divine inspiration, alleged or real, call on fellow human beings, including officers, soldiers, midshipmen, political decision makers, to restrain their behavior, to see the dignity of the other, to remind themselves of the judgment and justice of the divine, and thus to instill a sense of humility into the human beings who otherwise will easily believe that they are masters of life and death because they master the weapons of life and death. That is possibly the most important link, ethically speaking, between religion and war, to remind human beings that we are not God and therefore not masters of life and death. Basically, I would say, the focal point of the idea I have just tried to sketch, found in some way or another in most religions, is the idea of responsibility. To be responsible is to be answerable. That's basically what the term means. If you check across languages, almost all expressions of responsibility have as their core the term response, the idea that you need to answer. If someone comes to me and complains about the lecture room here, no need to do that, it's an excellent place, but I can say I cannot answer. And everyone understands that because I have no answer to give and one cannot expect it. When are we supposed to answer? Well, that is when we are responsible. What religion most basically can be said to bring to the ethics of war is the sense of being answerable. Naturally, that is not true only of war. In business, politics, sex, all kinds of communal affairs, religion has through the ages, for good and ill, been a source of norms to which human beings feel they must answer, indeed not just to the norms, but to the force behind them. But since, as the realism of Thomas Hobbes, whom I'm sure several of you have read, so strongly says, war is a field in which no human superior exists. War is an appeal to heaven, says John Locke a few decades after Hobbes. And as such, in a very real sense, it is a different and unique activity among human experiences. If you are not answerable to a superior authority on earth, to whom are you answerable? Now, whether or not we personally believe that the experience of heaven or of God or of transcendence, at least in some cases, is based on a true experience of the divine, and I'm sure there are different beliefs in this room. I call myself a believer, others will not. But we must take seriously either way that being answerable beyond the laws and commands of this world is a crucial source of a sense of obligation, a sense of shame, a sense of justice, of right and wrong. The Nuremberg and Tokyo trials after the Second World War rested on this very premise, after all, that to be human is to have obligations beyond the laws of the land. It is to be answerable to a higher law, because things that seem to be legally and politically legitimate can nonetheless be basically wrong. They may be legal, but not in the moral sense right. So, in listening to the presentations in the days ahead, I urge you to keep this in mind, to search for ways in which this idea of responsibility is conveyed, and also ways in which religions and religiously inspired cultures and their spokespersons and institutions fail to live up to the call to be responsible beyond one's own wishes, inclinations, local traditions, or lust for power. That leads me to the second part of my lecture. Once again, I will draw on some materials from the book that we have put together. It is a book where we have specialists within each tradition speaking about that tradition. Arguments can be made both ways. Should an outsider speak about them so that you get more of a critical view? But we have taken the point of departure where we want people to really understand what many of these texts say from within a long tradition to speak about them. It is quite remarkable how much such texts are spoken about without being read. How many people, for instance, claim to know a lot about jihad without ever having read the sources in Shia or Sunni Islam about them? How many claim to know a lot about just war tradition without ever having read Thomas Aquinas and Martin Luther? Or going back to the Bible, for that matter, and seeing what do they say? And indeed, we are proud to say that some of these texts that we do convey with the excellent commentaries of our chapter authors have not even been translated into English before, but will now be available within one volume. That was the second commercial break, and I promise you it's the last. It's just because I saw I'm 5 minutes ahead of schedule. So, Ed, we have more time for the coffee break. Now, the second part of my lecture. Together with my colleague, Nicole Hartwell, I have written an introductory piece to our volume, and we ask there what questions we need to ask ourselves as we confront texts, sacred or of religious significance, about warfare in general and the ethics of warfare in particular. This is a little bit like an attempt at making a sheet that you can have next to you when you read these sorts of texts. And you can check, have I answered these questions? Have I at least touched on them? And I hope you will find them useful as well. They are 8 in number. First, we have the question of whether the religious beliefs and practices we are dealing with serve to permit, and maybe even to encourage, the use of armed force, or whether they rather and primarily function as a restraint on, or even prohibition against such force, or whether maybe they do both, depending on the time, problem at hand, context, and not least, who reads them. As I learned in my first year philosophy course, hermeneutics is a circle. Understanding text is not just about the texts, but about who reads them. Our study of all these religious texts, along with our eminent chapter authors, have shown, at least me, how this is a deep dividing line, the encouragement or the restraint of violence. And there is no doubt that religion can contribute to both. And sometimes the meaning of an author may have been one thing, but it has functioned in another way. And I will come back to that problem as well. Number 2, we are, of course, as anyone will know, confronted with a challenge that one and the same text may be, and often indeed has been, susceptible to multiple interpretations, pertaining not only to the reasons that can be put forward in order to justify the use of armed force, but also to the question of how and against such force, whom such force can be used, both ad bellum and in bello questions. Anyone who has ever worked on religious studies will know that there are different schools. I love the joke I heard from a Jewish friend of mine about the Jewish loner. He lived quite by himself, no one else, on a desert island. He got a visitor, and the visitor pointed out, why on earth do you have 2 synagogues? You're all alone here. And he said, well, I attend the one synagogue, and the other I definitely do not attend. Now, this hermeneutical challenge takes on a grave character when parts of a text are selectively utilized in order to endorse, or it could be the opposite, the use of armed force, for reasons that maybe even seem contrary to its whole, possibly even contrary to the nature of the religious tradition that it is said to represent. Selective quoting and out-of-context use of statements, as well as emphasizing parts that do not fit with the whole, are recurring temptations when it comes to employing religion in the service of armed force. I would like to warmly recommend to you to read the chapter of Muhammad Fakhfuri on Shia Islam, which is a tour de force in trying to be very serious about what the texts say, not explain away anything, not trying to sugarcoat or excuse, but nonetheless always hold up texts to whether or not they fit with the ethos and the meaning of that tradition. And looking at what that means today, the part that John Kelsey has written in the chapter on Sunni Islam is also a great way of learning about the richness and the tensions within Islamic tradition. Third, who is to participate in and contribute to the endeavor of interpreting religious texts? That's actually an interesting question. Can I do that? Am I someone who should sit down and interpret a text that is originally pertaining to a tradition that is not mine? Should interpretation of religious texts be the exclusive domain of members of a particular religious faith, maybe even of just a few select members of that faith? Or should, quite the opposite, such a discussion take place between insiders and outsiders, possibly thereby constituting a precursor toward greater religious tolerance, understanding, and dialogue between individuals of diverging faiths? If we embrace that latter approach, which we after all do here, which we have tried to do in our book, for instance, with a view to utilizing classical texts to address present-day political realities, it is nonetheless important to bear in mind the need to be attentive to and respectful of the conventions of interpretation embedded within the religious traditions themselves, especially when we approach them as outsiders. Fourth, reflecting on the nature and purpose of each text found in the volume I've been talking about, we have been led to see the tension between texts that relate narratives that are supposed to work as examples of what we should do or not do. The Samaritan is not a list of rules, it's a story about a person in a concrete situation. And then on the other hand, we have those writings that contain direct injunctions to act in certain ways and not in others. The former will tell us, mythically or historically or in parables, what certain people in certain situations thought was the right or wrong thing to do, or were led or forced to do. Whereas the second will, through some authority, give us principled guidance or even commandments related to war or violence. These are two different sorts of writings, and it is crucial to be aware of that distinction if we are to understand and read the text rightly. And I guess sometimes we are tempted to think that the second form is more authoritative because it's clearer. These are rules. In Norway, we have this expression that all senior officers use. It's like a hot dog. That's what they tell you when you haven't understood an order. I didn't come that far. I'm only a second lieutenant, which is in Norway a fenrik, so I'm happy I'm Fenrik Henrik. That's at least something. But I remember that when I didn't understand things properly, they said, you have civilian porridge between your ears. That was the one. And the other is, you don't understand. It's a hot dog. It's just like this. But of course, in confronting religious texts, we should not automatically take for granted that it is the clear injunctions, the unambiguous texts about do this, that convey the deeper meaning of the tradition. Maybe we often find that in the narratives and in the stories. Fifth, we should be aware as we read these texts that sometimes they hold forth examples and principles that are meant to apply to all human beings, regardless of their religious belief or belonging, while other texts draw a sharper line between those within a religious community and those outside it. In the latter case, this may lead to the creation of different rules for how to treat human beings in the respective spheres. Is an insider meant to be treated differently from and better than an outsider? In some cases, the answer to this question is clearly specified. In other cases, one has to infer from the context what is meant, or whether any such distinction is implied at all. I think that many religious traditions today look back at their own history and see some rather terrifying examples, where on the one hand they find clear injunctions of restraint of violence, but it doesn't apply to the Turks, because of course they are somehow different. I'm not saying that that is a general trait, and now I of course just mentioned an example from medieval and early modern Christian religion, but it is there as a challenge. There are also cases in which a text has to be understood in terms of which sectors of society it is addressing. For instance, if a text is directed to a group of monks, we can assume that the ethical ideals espoused there are meant to apply primarily to the life of the monks or nuns, and not to everyone equally. This again shows the danger of quoting texts out of context. It may be that what is held forth is not meant to apply as generally as an out-of-context quote may imply. I'm sure there are speeches and lectures given here at the Naval Academy which would not apply to everyone outside the halls of the Academy. Sixth, there is a difference between religion representing an ideal, referred to and talked about as something to be strived for and aspired to, but hardly shaping concrete events, and religion informing political life and the vicissitudes of history much more directly. This is arguably related to the difference between what we philosophers call virtue ethics on the one hand and duty ethics or deontology on the other. The general ideal of peacefulness, the way the world ought to be, the way we ideally live, would often fall into the first category, whereas political injunctions from a religious authority at some specific moment concerning some specific event will, at least at the moment in question, fall into the second category. In reading the chapters in this book and other things I have read, I am especially struck by that challenge in various forms of Buddhism, where of course you have a very strong pacifistic undercurrent, which is very much there in a religion that has participated in violence and warfare repeatedly through the centuries. When we look at Sri Lanka over the last 20 years, we realize that this is not just some aberration or something that just came off wrong, but is clearly also religiously inspired to a certain extent, but within a religion that has as its very basic ethos respect for absolutely all, not just human life, but life per se. How is that possible? There's a great chapter in our book by Soho Makida, whom he wanted to be here, he could not come, on Japanese tradition. Grace's questions about that most tragic of events, the rape of Nanking, and asks questions in religious terms. We find some of the same, a bit differently, and this will something we'll come back to tomorrow, in Orthodox Christianity, as opposed to a certain extent, Catholic and Protestant Christianity, namely certain very strong ideas of peacefulness on the one hand and an imperial church on the other, seemingly existing side by side, and texts sometimes speaking very strongly about the love to be shown absolutely everyone and the role of the witness of the church, and then extolling the emperor for the military exploits. This leads to a related tension, number 7 on our list. We're getting towards the end. Namely, the tension between religion as tied to a political agenda and religion as not playing any official role in shaping politics. Here again, one and the same religious tradition may exhibit different traits at different times. Just think of the difference in Christian tradition between Tertullian in the 3rd century and Augustine in the 5th. The one is the outsider who is definitely not taking part in the politics of this world. That's the whole meaning of his religious affiliation. We are waiting for the end. The other, very shortly thereafter, ponders how to rule an empire. And it's the same religion. Indeed, in traditions that are marked by a plurality of branches or confessions, history has sometimes shown that representatives of the differing branches have found themselves in competition with one another to attain recognition and support from the state or the people. Sometimes one branch or confession may have political power and the other not, leading to strong tensions that become tied to or interpreted in light of religious difference. Coming from Germany and Erfurt, one cannot but help be astonished by the destruction of the religious wars of the 16th and 17th century, basically fought between human beings who believed strongly that one should turn the other cheek as an ideal. Valerie has written wonderfully on this in her chapter, delving not only into the magisterial reformers, but also the radical Reformation. Now, we should note, and that's of course my point in saying this, that the meaning of the text we are reading or discussing will often be better understood once we understand what this particular relationship consists in. That is, whether the text came from a religious tradition or religious denomination or branch that saw itself as political or as apolitical, and also what the role of the author or editor of the text was vis-a-vis the political authorities of his or her time. Here, just think of the difference between Islam on the one hand, or Islam and Christianity on the one hand, and Judaism on the other. After all, from approximately 70 AD to 1949, all discussions of what authorities should do when it comes to waging warfare were academic, because one didn't have a state. There is still a lot of discussion. Moses Maimonides in the Middle Ages writes insightfully on the use of armed force, but without any state to actually do it. And it's important to remember that when you read the text, because this is not advice to a prince, as many other writings in the history of warfare would be. Finally, we come to, as I've already indicated briefly, one of the most perplexing questions that we confront when we confront religion and war: the ambivalent relationship between religion and the undertaking of what we would normally have to call atrocities, from the rape of Nanking to the Holocaust, to take two 20th century examples. Now, none of those are religious actions. In many ways, even actions during the Crusades were not primarily meant to be religious. They were meant to be in defense of a territory. At the same time, it is clear that in some ways or another, religion has played a role. In some cases, we find that in order for soldiers to commit manifestly brutal acts, the values of a religious faith are called upon and even used as a motivation, sometimes in a way that seems to overpower and set aside the actual moral guidelines espoused by the religion itself. I'll mention there that I read a piece some years ago, and I don't know if you've ever had it this way, that you've read a really good article and you cannot find it. I cannot remember who was the author. I can't remember everything. I remember which library I was in, but that's about it. I hope to find it someday. But it was a great medieval historian who asked the interesting question: if Thomas Aquinas, who wrote about just cause, right intention, and legitimate authority, went out into the battlefield, what would have shocked him and what would he have liked? And the answer is that what would have shocked him was the absence of right intention if he had been part at the so-called battle orations on the eve, literally or figuratively, of battle. Because when you go and read the battle orations, they basically say that let's go and take the Franks. Because they're not human beings. They are monkeys who eat their children, these sorts of things. And we all know that these exist, and what they do convey is some sense of, no, there are certain ways in which we don't have to act now, even though we normally would, even though our religion, our faith says we should, because these are somehow people against whom we can do certain things. And then, the thesis of this article was, the unreferenced article, that Thomas Aquinas would have said, no, this is not fighting with a rightful intention. In other cases, a political system may draw upon religious elements in order to sacralize or make sacred its ideological cause through attempts to justify all actions of extremity for the good of the nation or some other higher cause. Of course, the Gott mit uns of National Socialism chillingly comes to mind. Now, my esteemed audience, I suggest that these are 8 points that hermeneutically, that is, in terms of interpreting, and substantially in terms of contents, we should carry with us as we read and discuss texts from religious traditions pertaining to the ethics of war. As for myself, I can say honestly that the study and co-editing of these texts have made me much more humble as to what I can say about these traditions. Like many of you, I have taught some introductory courses where sometimes I have to give some reference to what some religious tradition says. And I have some overview book and a cliff notes, and I gather together and try to find out, and here is this. And I realized it is more complicated than that. I remember the old great saying, I used to be in doubt, but now I'm not so sure anymore. But what I am sure of is that what has called us together here is an absolutely crucial task for our world today. It is something that my great co-editor Martin Cook has touched on and written on several times, namely the challenge that we are in military operations that operate across cultures, where we fight side by side with people from Poland or Brazil or Bangladesh. But when we look at what we get of submissions to the Journal of Military Ethics, they normally come from North America, a few countries in Northern Europe, Israel, and Australia. We are very happy now also to be working with eminent Chinese scholars, and things are opening up. But it is to us quite remarkable that this conversation we need to have between ourselves on the ethics of war and what our traditions say is not really as alive as it should be. And the way I understand the great work of Ed Barrett, that is part of what you are trying to do with this conference here. I think it also does make us more confident. I love the old Adlai Stevenson quote, "It's hard to lead a cavalry charge if you think you look funny on a horse." That's more a cavalry than a naval thing. But there is something about it, I think it gives us more certainty, not in the sense that we know everything, but at least that we have more of the words, the terminology, and of the understanding when we have engaged in the sorts of conversations that we will be having here. So therefore, it's natural for me to end with a deep thank you to the work that the Naval Academy, the Stockdale Center, and the McCain Conference do on bringing us to these tables. Thank you very much.
Dr. Syse, if you'll come up here for a minute. I do want to thank you for starting us off, getting the juices flowing, and having us think about this important subject. And we'd like to present you with a small token of our appreciation. When you open this up, you will find that this is a compass that says the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership. We consider this the moral compass, and throughout your life you have helped others continue to hone their moral compass, and we know yours is solid, and this will be a reminder to keep it that way throughout your lifetime. So thank you so much for starting us off.